Imagine this. You're walking through a crowded street. People rush past you, each with their own errands, their own lives. But if you could see the unseen, you'd notice something strange. Every single person is carrying a backpack, not the kind you buy at the store, but an invisible one. Inside are stones, some small, some heavy, and each stone holds a memory, a regret, a wound from the past. Some backpacks are so full they almost drag the person to the ground. Yet, they keep walking day after day, as if carrying this weight is the only way to live. What about you? If I could reach into your invisible backpack right now, what would I find? A love that ended years ago but still hurts. A mistake you replay in your head every night. An apology you never received or one you never gave. We don't see these backpacks, but we feel them in the heaviness in our chest, the tiredness that no sleep can fix, the way our smiles sometimes don't quite reach our eyes. The Buddha once said that holding onto the past is like grasping a burning coal, thinking it will somehow keep us warm. All it really does is burn. But here's the thing. The prison walls aren't made of steel. They are made of memories. And memories are just thoughts. Thoughts can be released. Yet most of us don't even realize we're behind bars. We wake up every morning and step into the same cell built from old stories we tell ourselves. Stories that say, I am this kind of person. This is what happened to me. This is why I can't change. We cling to these stories because they feel like us. Without them, who would we be? But what if that's exactly the point? What if the you you're defending is not even here anymore? The past is like a shadow cast by a sun that has already set. No matter how hard you try, you can't step into it again. And yet we keep turning back, hoping to find life in something that's already gone. There's a reason the present feels light and spacious when you're truly in it, because the present moment isn't cluttered with yesterday. It's only here that freedom lives. And this isn't about forgetting. It's about no longer letting yesterday be the warden of today. It's about walking without the backpack. It's about looking at your hands and realizing they are empty. And that's a good thing. Somewhere deep inside, you've always known there's another way to live. One that doesn't require you to drag your entire history behind you. One where your joy isn't borrowed from the past, and your peace isn't held hostage by it. If you've ever wondered what that life feels like, we're about to take the first step toward it. We think the past is behind us, but the truth is, we carry it right here in the folds of our mind, in the rhythm of our heartbeat, in the way we react without thinking. It's not just a memory. It's the way your chest tightens when you hear a certain song. It's the hesitation in your voice when you talk about love. It's the way your stomach drops when you see a number pop up on your phone. These are not random. They're the echoes of something that already happened, still living in your body, still whispering in your mind. Buddhism calls this upadana, clinging. It's the habit of holding on to what's already gone, as if the tighter we grip, the more real it will feel. But clinging doesn't make things real, it makes them heavy. Why do we do it? Because in some strange way it feels safe. The pain you know is familiar, and the familiar is easier to face than the unknown. So we keep our chains close, convincing ourselves they're bracelets. We replay old conversations, thinking we're learning from them, but really, we're just deepening the groove they leave in our mind. We revisit old wounds, not to heal them, but to make sure they are still there. It's like living in a house with the windows painted shut. The air is stale, but you've gotten used to breathing it. And the moment someone tells you there's fresh air outside, you hesitate because stepping out means leaving behind the walls you've called home. The Buddha taught that the mind is like a mirror. When dust covers it, we see only the dust, not the reflection. The past, when clung to, is that dust. And the more we try to polish it, thinking we can make it perfect, the thicker it becomes. But here's something we rarely consider. The past itself isn't the chain. It's our relationship to it. A memory is just a picture. It's the meaning we attach to it. This defines me. This is who I am. This is why I can't be free. That forges the lock. If you've ever wondered why it's so hard to move on, it's not because the past is too strong. It's because we keep feeding it with the energy of now. We water it with attention, and like a vine, it grows, wrapping itself tighter and tighter around our present. But the most dangerous part, we don't even notice the moment it happens. The chain doesn't clang when it falls into place. It's silent, smooth, almost comforting at first. Only later do we realize we can't move the way we used to. There's a quiet tragedy in this. Most people will live their whole lives never knowing they've been carrying a chain that was never locked. And maybe that's why you're here listening to these words. Some part of you knows. Some part of you is ready to reach for the key, even if your hands are trembling. We like to think of the past as solid, a mountain behind us, unchanging, permanent. But if you really look, it's more like a cloud. It shifts, it fades, it drifts away the moment you try to hold it still. The Buddha saw this with perfect clarity. He called it anicca, impermanence. Everything changes. Everything passes. Nothing, not even your greatest joy or deepest pain, stays the same. Yet we live as if the past is carved in stone. We replay it as if it's a fixed movie that will always end the same way. We tell ourselves, this is what happened and this is who I am because of it. But here's the strange thing, even the memory you have today is not the same one you had yesterday. Every time you recall it, you alter it. The colors shift, the details blur, your emotions twist it into something slightly new. Science calls this memory reconstruction. The Buddha called it Maya, illusion. Think about the river. The water that touched your hand a moment ago is already far downstream. You can try to scoop it back, but what you're holding now is not the same water. The past is like that river. You can remember standing on its banks, but the moment you step in again, it's a different current. The danger is in forgetting this. Because when we believe the past is permanent, we start building our identity on top of it. We say, I am a victim because this happened, or I am successful because I achieved this once. Both are chains, one made of sorrow, the other of pride, and both keep us from moving freely through the present. The Buddha taught that clinging to the past is like carrying a raft long after you've crossed the river. It may have served you once, but now it's just a burden. And yet we resist letting go. Why? Because permanence feels safe. It gives us the illusion of control, a story we can point to and say, this is who I am. But impermanence is not our enemy. It is our liberation, because if nothing is fixed, then your pain is not fixed either. If nothing is permanent, then every moment, including this one, is a chance to step out of the story you've been telling yourself. Imagine if you could see your past for what it truly is, a collection of shifting clouds in the vast sky of your mind. Would you still try to hold them? Or would you watch them drift away, making space for the light to shine through? Somewhere in that space, a truth begins to whisper. That freedom is not about erasing what came before. It's about seeing that it was never as solid as you believed. Some memories are light. A smile from a stranger, the smell of rain on warm concrete, a song that takes you back to a summer evening. They pass through you gently like a breeze, but others sit in your chest like a stone. You don't even need to think about them, they live there, pressing against your heart, changing the way you breathe. It might be the face of someone who betrayed you, a moment you failed when it mattered most, or a single sentence that cut so deep you can still hear it echo years later. The mind doesn't just store events, it stores the emotions that came with them. And over time, those emotions harden, turning from water into ice. Buddhism calls this S, a letter 1E45KH, a macron R, a mental formations. They are the grooves our mind carves when certain thoughts and feelings repeat over and over. The more we revisit a painful memory, the deeper the groove becomes, until it feels impossible to climb out. And here's the tricky part. We don't just remember the event, we relive it. Your body doesn't know the difference between a danger that's in front of you and one that's only in your head. So every time you replay the scene, your heart races, your muscles tense, your stomach knots. It's why a single memory can feel heavier than years of actual living. Because you've carried it not once, but hundreds of times every time you let it run again in your mind. Think of it like a backpack. The event itself is just one stone, but each replay adds another stone on top. Soon, you're not carrying the past, you're carrying the weight of carrying the past. And yet we hold on. Why? Because in some strange way the pain becomes part of who we think we are. We fear that if we set it down, we'll lose a piece of ourselves. But the truth, what you lose is only the chain. The real you, the one beneath the weight, has been here all along, waiting to breathe again. The Buddha often compared the mind to a clear pond. Drop a stone in and the ripples distort the reflection. Drop enough stones and the water becomes unrecognizable. But if you stop throwing stones, slowly the surface becomes still. And in that stillness, you can see your true face again. Memories are not the enemy. They are simply moments that have passed. It is the emotional weight we tie to them, the meaning we keep reinforcing, that makes them heavy. And the moment you realize this, something inside begins to loosen. Like a knot you thought would never come undone, suddenly, quietly, begins to unravel. Long ago, in the quiet hills of an old monastery, two monks were traveling together. The morning air was cool, the forest alive with the sound of birdsong. They walked in silence, as monks often do, each step measured, each breath steady. Eventually, the forest path opened to a river. Its waters were swift, churning white over hidden rocks. On the bank stood a woman dressed in fine silk, clearly unprepared for the crossing. She looked worried, her eyes darting from the water to the distant shore. "Please," she called out, "I need to get across, but the current is too strong." The younger monk froze. Their vows were clear, they were not to touch women. To him, her request was impossible. But without a word, the older monk stepped forward. He lifted the woman onto his back and carried her through the rushing water. When they reached the other side, he set her down gently. She bowed in gratitude, and without another word went on her way. The two monks continued their journey. An hour passed, then two. Not a word was spoken, but the younger monk's face was tense. Finally, unable to hold it in, he said, "Brother, our vows forbid contact with women. Why did you carry her?" The older monk smiled softly. "I set her down hours ago," he said. "Why are you still carrying her?" The Buddhist teachings often hide in stories like this. The woman was not the true weight, the thought of her was. The younger monk didn't carry her in his arms, but in his mind, mile after mile. How many times have we done the same? We put something down physically, a relationship, a job, a mistake, but in our minds we keep holding it. We replay the scene, argue with it, try to change what's already finished. And with every replay, the weight grows heavier. The older monk understood something vital. The past, no matter how vivid, is over the moment it happens. To cling to it is to carry a ghost, and ghosts only have power if we keep feeding them our attention. Letting go doesn't mean erasing the memory. It means no longer letting it ride on your back when it doesn't belong there anymore. As the path ahead opens, the forest becomes quieter. You begin to notice the breeze again, the warmth of the sun, the sound of your own footsteps. This is what happens when you set something down. The world becomes lighter. If letting go makes the world lighter, why do we hold on so tightly? It's not because the past has chains stronger than steel. It's because the chains are woven into who we think we are. From the moment we're born, we start building a story about ourselves. Each experience becomes a chapter. The people we meet, the words they say, the things we do, they all become threads in the tapestry of me. And here's the thing. Even the painful threads feel essential. A betrayal becomes part of our identity. A failure becomes a landmark on the map of our life. We start to believe that without these moments, without these scars, we wouldn't know who we are. So when someone says, "Just let it go," it can feel like they're asking us to tear pages out of our own story, to erase a piece of ourselves. The Buddha saw this fear. He called it atta, the belief in a permanent self. And he taught anatta, no self. Not because we don't exist, but because what we call self is not fixed. It's a flowing river, not a stone statue. But the ego resists this truth. It clings to old identities like armor, even when that armor is crushing us. Why? Because the unknown, the space without that armor, feels terrifying. It's like standing at the edge of a cliff. On your back is a heavy pack filled with old stones. Someone tells you, "Drop it, you'll feel free." But your mind whispers, "What if I need them? What if they are the only thing keeping me safe?" The truth is, we're not afraid of losing the past. We're afraid of losing ourselves without it. But here's the paradox: the you that you're afraid of losing is not the real you. It's a bundle of stories, emotions, and labels that have shifted 1,000 times already. Every cell in your body has changed since that moment you keep replaying. Every thought you've had since then has rewritten you piece by piece, and still you are here. This is why the Buddha compared clinging to the past to grasping a rope that's burning your hands. You could drop it, but you don't. Not because the rope is holding you, but because you believe that without it you'll fall. The first step toward letting go is not prying your fingers open. It's realizing you were never hanging over a cliff to begin with. Somewhere inside, beyond the stories and the fear, there's a part of you that knows how to release. It's the same part that exhales at the end of a long day. The same part that relaxes when you hear a song you love. The same part that, in moments of pure presence, forgets the past entirely. And if you can trust that part, even for a moment, you might find that letting go isn't something you force. It's something that happens naturally, when you see you were never really holding on to anything solid at all. The past is a shadow. The future is a mirage. The only place life truly happens is here. But here is slippery. It's the moment between breaths, the pause between heartbeats. Turn your attention away for even a second and it slips back into yesterday or rushes ahead into tomorrow. That's why mindfulness is not just a practice, it's a remembering. A remembering of where life actually is. Buddhism calls it sati, awareness, presence, the art of being fully awake in this very moment. Not awake like opening your eyes in the morning, but awake in a way that your whole being is present. Where you taste your tea instead of drinking it absent-mindedly. Where you hear the rain instead of just noticing that it's wet outside. Where you feel your own breath as if it were the very first one you've ever taken. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment." It sounds simple, but when you try, you'll see the mind is like a restless puppy. It runs to the past, it chases the future, it refuses to sit still. So how do we call it back? Start with the breath. It is always here, always now. When the mind begins to wander, notice the inhale, notice the exhale. Not to control it, not to judge it, just to know it's happening. Like an anchor in a storm, the breath brings you back to shore. Then open your senses. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Listen to the hum of life around you, the wind in the trees, the distant murmur of voices, the soft rhythm of your own heartbeat. These are not background noise. They are life itself. Mindfulness is not about pushing the past away. It's about making the present so vivid, so alive, that the past simply loses its grip. When you are fully here, yesterday fades like a dream you've just woken from. And in that clarity, something shifts. You begin to see that your thoughts are just thoughts, not chains. Memories are just visitors, not permanent residents. Emotions are just waves, not the ocean itself. This is where freedom begins. Not in some distant enlightenment, not in a future moment when everything is perfect, but in the simple act of returning again and again to right now. The mind will wander, that's its nature. But each time you notice and return, it's like unlocking a small door inside yourself. And behind that door is a space so vast, so light, that you wonder how you ever thought you were trapped. When you live in this space, the past doesn't disappear, but it no longer drives your steps. You walk lighter, you breathe deeper, and you start to notice. The world has been waiting for you here all along. Sometimes the chains of the past are not made of events. They are made of people, faces we once loved, voices that once wounded us, words we can't unsay and moments we can't undo. It's easy to tell ourselves, just let go. But what about the weight that still aches in the heart? What about the scars that still whisper at night? This is where compassion enters. In Buddhism, compassion, K-A-R-U letter 1E47 a macron, is not pity, and it's not weakness. It is the courage to open your heart to pain without turning it into a weapon. It is the willingness to see that behind every harsh word, behind every hurtful act, there was also suffering. The person who betrayed you was carrying their own storms. The one who hurt you was likely hurt themselves. Even the part of you that made mistakes, that part was only doing the best it could with the understanding it had at the time. Compassion is not about excusing the past. It's about understanding it so deeply that the need to punish yourself or others dissolves. And in that dissolution, space appears, space for something softer. Forgiveness grows in that space. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. It is not declaring that what happened was okay. It is declaring that you will no longer let what happened be your prison. It is giving up the hope of a better past so you can live in a better present. The Buddha once told a story of a man pierced by an arrow. The man refused to pull it out until he knew who shot it, what the arrow was made of, why it was fired. But in the time he spent asking, the poison spread. We do the same when we cling to resentment. We wait for answers, for apologies, for the past to change. Meanwhile, the poison seeps deeper. Forgiveness is pulling the arrow out, even if you never learn the full story. It's choosing to heal, even if the other person never says, "I'm sorry." And sometimes the hardest forgiveness is the one we give ourselves. We replay the moment we failed, the words we wish we could take back, the road we didn't take. But holding on to that self-punishment is like holding a burning coal. We are the only ones getting burned. When compassion meets forgiveness, the past begins to dissolve. Not vanish, but lose its sharp edges, its ability to cut us. What was once a wound becomes a scar. And even scars under the right light can be beautiful. And as the weight lifts, something unexpected happens. We start to see others differently. We begin to walk through the world with softer eyes. We realize that everyone we meet is carrying some invisible burden. And just maybe, our gentleness can be the reason they choose to set theirs down. Freedom is not just an idea, it's a practice. A muscle you train one small choice at a time. You don't wake up one morning suddenly unshackled from every memory, every regret, every hurt. You wake up, take a breath, and choose again and again to live unbound. Here's how. Step 1, begin with awareness. Each morning before the noise begins, pause. Feel your breath enter, feel it leave. Ask yourself, what am I carrying today that I don't need? It could be an old resentment, a self-criticism, a conversation replaying in your head. Just noticing it is the first cut to the chain. Step 2, release in small doses. You don't have to forgive a lifetime in a day. Maybe you start by letting go of the stranger who cut you off in traffic, then the colleague who spoke without thinking. Over time, your capacity to release grows like a river widening as it flows. Step 3, anchor yourself in the present. Carry something with you, a bead, a bracelet, a smooth stone, not as a charm, but as a reminder. Every time you touch it, bring your mind back to where your feet are, here, now. The past cannot follow you into this moment unless you invite it. Step 4, practice gratitude as a shield. Gratitude does not erase pain, but it changes the way pain lives inside you. List 3 things each night you're thankful for, even if they are small. The smile of a friend, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the quiet between 2 raindrops. Gratitude turns your mind toward what is alive, not what is lost. Step 5, serve others without expecting return. When you help someone really help, the past loses its grip. Why? Because your energy is flowing outward into something that matters now. Even the smallest act, holding a door, listening without interrupting, can remind you that life is still unfolding, still worth showing up for. Step 6, speak kindly to yourself. Your inner voice can either free you or cage you. If you catch it speaking with cruelty, pause, ask yourself, would I say this to a dear friend? If not, change the tone. Freedom often begins in the words we use with ourselves. Step 7, accept impermanence again and again. Every joy, every sorrow, every heartbeat is temporary. When you truly see this, you stop clinging so hard. You can savor moments without needing to freeze them, because you know that's not how life works. Living unbound is not a destination, it's a rhythm. Some days you'll feel light, other days the old chains may rattle again. That's okay. Freedom is not the absence of weight. It's the choice to put it down, even if you have to do it 1,000 times. And here's the secret, the more you live this way, the more the past begins to feel like an old story someone once told you. The emotions fade, the sharp edges soften, and you realize you've been walking without chains for a while now. You just hadn't noticed. The journey we've walked together has not been about escaping life. It's been about returning to it. We began in the invisible prison, walls built not of stone, but of memories, fears, and old stories we kept telling ourselves. We saw how the past can cling like vines, how illusions of permanence keep us trapped, how even our memories carry emotional weight that shapes the way we see the world. We listened to the parable of the two monks, learning that carrying the past is a choice, even when it feels like it isn't. We explored why letting go can feel so impossible, and discovered that the present moment, alive, breathing, is the one place where freedom truly exists. We learned that compassion and forgiveness are not favors we grant to others, but keys that unlock our own chains. We stepped into the practice of living unbound, not as a lofty ideal, but as something we can touch, taste, and live every single day. And now, here we stand. At the doorway, true freedom is not somewhere far away. It's not hidden in a future you must chase or buried in a past you must solve. It's here. It's in your breath, in your step, in this heartbeat. Every moment you choose to be here without dragging the past behind you, you walk through this doorway. The Buddha once said, "In the sky, there is no distinction of east and west." People create distinctions out of their own minds and then believe them to be true. The same is true of your chains. They exist because you keep believing in them. So here is the truth, simple and unadorned. You are already free. Not because the past has vanished, but because you can set it down right now. And when you do, you'll feel it, the lightness, the space, the quiet joy of a life unbound. Step through. The door has always been open. The journey we've walked together has not been about escaping life. It's been about returning to it. We began in the invisible prison, walls built not of stone, but of memories, fears, and old stories we kept telling ourselves. We saw how the past can cling like vines, how illusions of permanence keep us trapped, how even our memories carry emotional weight that shapes the way we see the world. We listened to the parable of the two monks, learning that carrying the past is a choice, even when it feels like it isn't. We explored why letting go can feel so impossible and discovered that the present moment, alive, breathing, is the one place where freedom truly exists. We learned that compassion and forgiveness are not favors we grant to others, but keys that unlock our own chains. We stepped into the practice of living unbound, not as a lofty ideal, but as something we can touch, taste, and live every single day. And now, here we stand. At the doorway, true freedom is not somewhere far away. It's not hidden in a future you must chase or buried in a past you must solve. It's here. It's in your breath, in your step, in this heartbeat. Every moment you choose to be here without dragging the past behind you, you walk through this doorway. The Buddha once said, "In the sky, there is no distinction of east and west." People create distinctions out of their own minds and then believe them to be true. The same is true of your chains. They exist because you keep believing in them. So here is the truth, simple and unadorned. You are already free. Not because the past has vanished, but because you can set it down right now. And when you do, you'll feel it. The lightness, the space, the quiet joy of a life unbound. Step through. The door has always been open. If this message touched something within you, if it brought even a moment of stillness to your day, consider joining our journey here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe, not as a follower, but as a fellow traveler. Each week, we explore the timeless teachings of the Buddha and how they can help us live with more clarity, compassion, and freedom. May your path be light, your heart be open, and your steps be free.